Hello and welcome to the Serve Asia podcast, where you find stories, interviews and interesting discussions about how the good news of Jesus is being shared with the peoples of East Asia. I'm your host Ryan, and on today's episode I'm going to be interviewing the show's co-host Kat. And this episode is all about film. There is a big opportunity that is presented to us as Christians to watch a film with someone, which can then lead to having a really meaningful conversation about bigger topics. We'll talk about how when we understand how story structure works, we see that story structure actually transcends cultures. And so films are especially effective in reaching people from different cultures, as it can create a real shared experience that opens up questions and conversation points. Kat, tell us a little bit about your background, because you've got a background in film, haven't you?
Yeah, so I have a degree in film, but the university I went to was a Bible university where you had to minor in biblical education or biblical studies, but all of your major work was integrated with Bible. So I had a biblical integration of film and Bible. So it was really interesting.
So what kind of things would you be learning about on your course? How does film and the Bible integrate together?
So we learned a lot of practical things as well, like how to write a screenplay, how to produce a short film. But where the integration really came in was in story structure and how we view story. And, the gospel is one big story where it's all connected. It has a structure to it. It has a center point. And that's how we write movies today. And that's even how stories were structured back in the day when they were just spoken around a fire.
So can you explain a little bit more about this story structure that you're talking about that is true of the gospel narrative, but also true of stories that work in films?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a difference between story and plot. But for this podcast right now, I'm just going to talk about story. So just to give you the differences between the two, story is more about the theme and the character arcs, but plot is more about what happens, the plot points in it, what trouble do they run into. But story is more about the way the characters grow, the themes that are integrated in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so rather than being more specifically how they grow, it's the fact that they have grown.
Kind of. Yeah, so it's less about what happens and more about, it's less about what points happen along the way. It's more about how things change.
Okay. Can you give an example of?
Yeah, so in story, you have the thesis, antithesis, and thesis reinstated.
Okay, explain those things. Break it down for us.
You got it. Okay, so I'll use an example. So in Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, at the very beginning, when Frodo receives the ring, right, that's his call to action. That's his call to adventure. That's when the story really starts. So you find out that he has this call and it's his burden to bear. He has to take the ring to Rivendell.
Is that what you call a thesis?
No, we're almost there.
Okay,
so
sorry.
That's plot.
Yeah.
Now we're going to get to the thesis. So, yeah. So the theme is that he has to bear this burden alone of the ring. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you come to the antithesis where it's at Rivendell. He's already gone through all this. He was stabbed by a shadowy ghost king.
Yeah.
And I love that, shadowy ghost king. So he was stabbed. He's had a lot of trials, but he still carried the ring on his own. He goes to the council and he says, I'll take the ring to Mordor. Because again, the theme is coming back, that it's his burden to bear. But then Gandalf comes in and he says, as long as it's your burden to bear, I'll help you carry this burden. So it's saying that although the thesis that was stated is true, although it is Frodo's burden to bear. Gandalf's going to help him carry the burden. So it's saying that you don't have to bear your burdens alone.
Okay, so that is the antithesis?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
So the antithesis.
The antithesis. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you said, so you've got the thesis, which is Frodo has to carry this burden alone. And then the antithesis is it's his burden to carry alone, but he's not going to do it alone as well. Is that right?
Yeah, he doesn't have to carry it alone.
He doesn't have to carry it alone, yeah.
Yeah.
And so then the third thing you said, it was the thesis is reinstated.
Yeah, the thesis reinstated.
Okay.
So at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, spoiler, you have Frodo going off on his own. Because again, he believes that he has to carry the ring alone. He has to take the ring to Mordor alone. And he's off on the boat, and Sam runs after him, and Frodo says, "I'm going alone." And then Sam says, "Of course you are, but I'm going with you." So the thesis and theme works the same way that it would in an argument.
Okay, yeah. So you've spoken about thesis, antithesis, and thesis reinstated, and how that applies to the story, and that kind of structure of a story is something that applies not just to good storytelling in films, but the reason why it's actually is good storytelling is because it finds its origin in the story of the gospel, of what the Bible, the big narrative of the Bible. So how do you apply thesis, antithesis, and thesis reinstated to the biblical narrative?
So the thesis would be that God created man and that it was good. The antithesis would be that man sinned. Then the thesis reinstated would be Jesus and the creation of the new heaven and the new earth. So then again saying that although man sinned, God's creation is still good and God's going to redeem what he created.
Amazing. So can we say that all stories then find their origin in this big story that is overarching all of history and all of creation? Is that why we like stories, because it's written into the fabric of creation?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say people have always needed structure in story to be able to find it. You know, the Bible was a story that was shared around a fire. It was shared verbally before it was written down.
Yeah.
And that humans just have this need for story. We enjoy hearing other people's stories. We enjoy sharing our own stories. And that's really what unites us in different, regardless of background, stories is what brings us together.
Yeah. Because I was born in the UK and I've lived in the UK all my life. So I find it amazing to think about like this really simple story structure that's been told throughout history in all different cultures. It's connected with humans throughout history and across the globe as well. And so that is probably telling us something, isn't it? That stories work, and they work for a reason, because it connects to the true story, which is overriding all of our lives. So it was really interesting what you're saying about Lord of the Rings earlier. Are there any other films that we can look at to draw out this story structure that's common, that also applies to the gospel?
Yeah, I think you can pretty much draw it out of any story that you like. But for this podcast, I'd love to talk about the movie The Help.
Okay, what's that film? It's
one of my favorite movies, but it's about Mississippi in the 1960s. So the theme of that, so when the theme stated, it's about how God tells us to love our enemies. So there's a lot of different stories happening in the movie The Help, but this theme hits every single story that's happening. So there's different characters, there's different arcs, but each person tries to figure out how to love their enemy, and some people don't come to a conclusion at the end. So at the beginning of the movie, one of the maids, because it's about maids in Mississippi, and it covers a lot of issues about race. So one of the maids, the minister basically tells her at church, like, God says we need to love our enemies and we need to come through with that. We need to overcome whatever our enemies have against us, and we need to love them through that. And then the antithesis is that the maid gets to a point where she feels like she can't learn to love people that hate her. She can't learn to love that. But then the thesis reinstated, she ends up being fired from her job as a maid, and she walks out of the house. And she's narrating the story, so you hear in her narration, God says we need to love our enemies, but it's hard to do. But it can start by telling the truth.
I see, yeah.
So it's this whole idea that at first it was God tells us to love our enemies. And then in the middle of the movie where the antithesis is, she's like, how am I supposed to do this? I can't love my enemy. And then at the end of the movie, she realizes that with the power of truth, with the power of sharing her testimony on what it was like to be a maid in Mississippi, like, that's how you love your enemy.
I see. So that's like quite so it follows that story structure, but also has something quite practical for the Christian in understanding what it means to love neighbor, and how telling the truth is vital in that.
Yeah, definitely.
So why have we chosen to do a podcast on this particular topic? Are there any practical things we can take away from understanding story and understanding the story of films and understanding how it connects to the gospel? What can we do practically to take away from understanding that a bit more?
Definitely. I think films are a practical way of starting a discussion with people. And pretty much everyone likes movies, especially like the Marvel films. Like, people go out and see them all the time. Everyone goes and sees movies. Everyone has seen at least one movie. So something practical you can do is start a film club, either at your university or just have screenings at your house and invite people. And then after the film is done, you can discuss. And it's a great learning experience for everyone. It's a great way to learn more about each other and learn more about film. But it's also a great way to start talking about the gospel.
Yeah, and that sounds just like a great way, not just a practical, way in to have certain conversations, but just to get to know people as well, and to just have fun with them and build friendships as well.
Yeah, get some fellowship.
Yeah.
I do think something that I've ran into a lot as a Christian who wants to make movies is a lot of Christians are fearful of media and film and TV. And yeah, I kind of get the back end of that at times. And I do understand not everything on TV is for everyone. And I do think as Christians, we need to have our line on what we can watch and what we can't watch. And we need to know what's going to lead us to sin, because that's our responsibility as Christians. But what makes, like, if it's not giving you energy, if it's not giving you hope, like kind of what Levi said about social media in our earlier episode, if it's not giving you life, then don't watch it. And I think it's the same with TV and film. But I do also think that there's positive things in film and TV, that movies do bring people together. You see all different types of people going into a movie theater, and we're all sitting watching the same film. And to be able to sit afterwards and discuss, like, I really think that's a practical and beneficial way for us to start talking about the gospel.
One other thing that just occurred to me as well, and like a practical thing for, if you have a passion, like this is the Serve Asia podcast, if you have a passion for reaching out to, if you're based in the UK and maybe you've got friends who are from somewhere in Asia, maybe it's at university or in your workplace or whatever, you might find there's a bit of a language barrier at times. Whereas one of the great things about DVDs is that you can choose subtitles for loads of languages. So you could easily, like, if you struggle to have too much of an in-depth conversation because of language barriers, you could easily sit down, watch a film and put subtitles on in their native language. And you're sitting there having the same experience as them. And it can give you a real platform to build things to talk about and to actually, it will help them with their language, language development as well, but also just help develop your friendship as well, and give you an opportunity to share your perspective on the film.
Yeah, definitely. Movies are so universal because most of them do follow that structure. So although you might not understand the film stylistically or the film culturally, you will understand what's happening. And that could always lead to a discussion afterwards. And of course, like, you have subtitles, we have the technology to share stories. And one of my favorite things about Hollywood right now is that they keep making Pirates of the Caribbean movies. No one in America is watching them. I mean, I go and watch them because I'm a sucker for it, but people, like, they just keep being made. So I looked it up because I was like, why is Disney doing this to all of us? And I found out that the reason why Pirates of the Caribbean movies are being made is because they do so well in China. Like, that's where they make double their money, is just in China. So the fact that, like, Chinese movie theaters are showing Pirates of the Caribbean it just like blows my mind how integrated our cultures can be with technology and with movies. And that's just such a great starting point in talking to people and reaching out with people, is that although we're from different cultures, we're watching the same movies, because Marvel films do really well in China as well. I just think that's so cool.
Yeah. And realizing what I just said about, we could sit down, watch the DVD and put it in their native language, we could also easily source a film from maybe your friend's country, and then you get to learn more about their culture, and you can watch it in English subtitles as well. So you've got this sort of two-way thing going on of understanding one another's cultures and getting to experience that story that you can both identify with as well.
Yeah, something that I really loved about my university is how they really pushed to be multicultural, and they had a cultural center where they would show international films. And watching films, like, although I'll never know what it's like to grow up in a different culture, because I grew up in the same culture, although I'll never know what it's like, I can get an idea and I can get a respect and appreciation for other cultures by watching different films. So I think a big takeaway from this is that if you find your passion, like what you want to do in life, or find something that you're passionate about, like whether it's films or football, like there are passions that are international, and that can help us learn more about different cultures by following that passion.
Yeah, bridge those gaps where there might be some language barriers or something like that.
Definitely.
Well, Kat, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and what you learn on your doing your film and Bible degree. And our hope for this episode is that you go away feeling like you can watch a film and understand how it connects to the big storyline of the gospel, but also to have that practical thing as well, to go away and to maybe start a film club or just invite a friend over who might not be a Christian, and that can be a great chance just to deepen those friendships, and could well lead to a really interesting and fruitful conversation about the gospel.
Yeah, definitely. Go watch some movies.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode of the Serve Asia podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or anything else, then we would love to hear from you. You can get in touch by emailing uk.podcast@omfmail.com. Alternatively, you could send us a direct message on Instagram at Serve Asia Podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, then please do share it with anyone you know who has a heart for sharing Jesus cross-culturally. And also a 5-star review on iTunes goes a long way. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.